In the middle of downtown Seattle, chaos erupted as a 90-pound German Shepherd named Storm tore through a crowded marketplace. People screamed and scattered as the massive dog, trained for military combat, seemed to have lost all control. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but everyone knew that standard protocol meant one inevitable outcome for an out-of-control K9 unit. What happened next would change everything anyone thought they knew about the unbreakable bond between a handler and their partner. Sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't strength, speed, or even training. Sometimes it's just one word spoken at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person. This is the true story of how a single word stopped a 90-pound weapon in its tracks and revealed a truth that would shake the entire canine community to its core. Sarah Martinez had always believed that dogs could sense things humans couldn't. Growing up in rural Texas, she watched her grandmother's old blue heeler predict storms hours before the first clouds appeared. But nothing in her childhood prepared her for the day she would meet Storm, a German Shepherd whose story would challenge everything she thought she knew about loyalty, trauma, and the invisible threads that connect souls across species. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah was reviewing case files at the Seattle Police Department's K9 Unit headquarters when Lieutenant Roberts burst through the door, his face grim. As the department's lead animal behavioral specialist, Sarah had seen plenty of difficult cases, but something in Roberts' expression made her stomach tighten. "We've got a situation," Roberts said, dropping a thick file on her desk. "Storm, one of our best K9s, just attacked his handler during a routine training exercise." Sarah opened the file and immediately understood why Roberts looked so concerned. Storm's record was impressive. 3 years of exemplary service, successful drug busts, tracking operations that had saved lives, and commendations from both the mayor and the state police commissioner. Canines with records like this didn't just snap without reason. "Where's Officer Hendricks now?" Sarah asked, studying a photo of Storm, a magnificent German Shepherd with intelligent dark eyes and a coat that gleamed like polished obsidian. "Hospital. 23 stitches in his forearm, and he's lucky Storm didn't go for his throat." Robert sat down heavily. "Storm's in isolation at the training facility. The captain wants him evaluated and, well, you know what the protocol is for canines who attack their handlers." Sarah knew. In most cases, a canine who turned on their handler was considered irreparably compromised. The bond of trust that formed the foundation of police work was considered broken beyond repair. The standard recommendation was euthanization, but Sarah had learned to look deeper than standard protocols. In her 5 years working with traumatized police dogs, she discovered that aggressive behavior often masked something much more complex. Dogs, especially highly trained working dogs, didn't just forget their conditioning overnight. The drive to the canine training facility took 30 minutes through Seattle's winding streets. Sarah used the time to review Storm's file more thoroughly. Born at a specialized breeding facility in Germany, Storm had been selected for his intelligence, drive, and stability. His early training record showed exceptional marks in obedience, protection work, and narcotics detection. He'd been partnered with Officer David Hendricks 2.5 years ago, and their performance evaluations consistently rated them as one of the top K9 teams in the Pacific Northwest. The training facility sat on 20 acres outside the city, surrounded by chain-link fencing and security cameras. Sarah had been here dozens of times, but today the place felt different. As she walked toward the isolation kennels, she could hear Storm before she saw him, a low, continuous growling that seemed to vibrate through the concrete walls. The kennel area was dimly lit, designed more for containment than comfort. Storm occupied the last cage on the right, and when Sarah first laid eyes on him, her breath caught. The magnificent dog from the photos looked like a shadow of himself. His coat was dull and matted, his eyes darted constantly around the space, and his body language screamed of an animal in severe psychological distress. Tom Bradley, the facility's head trainer, approached with obvious caution. "Been like this since we brought him in yesterday morning," Tom said, keeping his voice low. "Won't eat, won't drink much, and he lunges at anyone who gets within 3 feet of the cage."
Sarah studied Storm's behavior carefully.
The dog wasn't displaying the random aggression of an animal that had simply gone bad. His movements were hypervigilant, his breathing rapid and shallow. Every muscle in his body appeared coiled for immediate action. Did something perfect. These weren't the signs of a vicious dog. These were the signs of a terrified one. "Has anyone tried to work with him since the incident?" Sarah asked. Tom shook his head. "Captain's orders. No contact until you've done your evaluation. Word is, they're planning to put him down by Friday if you can't find a reason not to." Friday. That gave Sarah 3 days to unravel whatever had transformed one of the department's most reliable canines into a dog so dangerous he couldn't be handled. She pulled out her observation notebook and began documenting Storm's behavior patterns, looking for clues that might explain the sudden change. For the next 2 hours, Sarah observed Storm from various distances and angles. She noted that his aggressive displays intensified when male voices echoed through the facility, but he seemed marginally calmer when the area was quiet. His breathing pattern suggested chronic stress, and the way he positioned himself in the far corner of the cage indicated he felt trapped with no escape route. Most telling was what happened when Sarah tried a simple test. She placed a bowl of high-value treats just outside his cage and retreated to observe. A normal aggressive dog might ignore the food entirely, focused only on perceived threats. But Storm's behavior was different. He clearly wanted the treats. His nose twitched, and he took a half-step toward them, but something stopped him. Fear? Confusion? Sarah couldn't tell yet, but his hesitation suggested his aggression might be masking something else entirely. As evening approached, Sarah decided to try something unconventional. She asked Tom to clear the area of all other personnel and dim the lights to create a calmer environment. Then, instead of approaching Storm's cage directly, she sat on the floor about 10 feet away and simply waited. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Storm continued his vigilant pacing, occasionally glancing in her direction but maintaining his defensive posture. Then, gradually, something shifted. His pacing slowed. The constant growling faded to occasional huffs. Sarah remained perfectly still, letting Storm dictate the pace of any interaction. It was nearly dark when Storm finally stopped moving entirely. He settled into a sitting position, still alert but no longer in constant motion. For the first time since Sarah had arrived, the dog looked directly at her and held eye contact for more than a few seconds. In that moment, Sarah saw something in Storm's eyes that changed everything. It wasn't aggression or madness, it was recognition, not of her specifically, but of someone who wasn't a threat, someone who understood that sometimes, sitting quietly in the darkness was exactly what a traumatized soul needed. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the facility before dawn, determined to dig deeper into Storm's background. The initial file had covered his training and service record, but Sarah suspected the real answers lay in more recent events. She requested access to all of Storm's activity logs, medical records and incident reports from the past 6 months. What she found in those records made her heart sink. 3 months ago, Storm and Officer Hendricks had responded to a domestic violence call that had gone horribly wrong. The suspect had barricaded himself in a house with his wife and 2 young children as hostages. This is the book. It's about history. Storm had been sent in to locate and neutralize the threat, but what he found inside that house wasn't just a dangerous criminal. It was a scene of violence so brutal that even the seasoned officers at the scene struggled to process it. The suspect had already killed his wife before the police arrived. The children, ages 6 and 8, were found hiding in a bedroom closet, traumatized but alive. Storm had been the one to find them, and according to the incident report, the children had clung to the dog while waiting for paramedics to arrive. But the most disturbing detail was buried in a supplemental report filed by a crime scene investigator. The suspect, before taking his own life, had severely beaten the family's pet dog, a small mixed breed named Lucky. Storm had found Lucky's body in the kitchen, and officers noted that the canine had exhibited unusual behavior for the remainder of the call, staying close to the children and refusing to leave their side even when ordered to do so by his handler. Sarah realized she was looking at a case of secondary trauma. Storm hadn't just witnessed violence. He'd been forced to work in an environment where the scent of fear, death, and animal suffering permeated everything. For a dog with Storm's intelligence and sensitivity, processing such an experience could be devastating. The pieces began falling into place when Sarah reviewed the training exercise that had triggered Storm's attack on Officer Hendricks. It had been a scenario designed to simulate a hostile home invasion, exactly the type of situation that might trigger traumatic memories in a dog still processing what he'd witnessed 3 months earlier. But there was still something missing from the puzzle. Storm's reaction had been specifically directed at his handler, someone he'd worked with successfully for years. If trauma was the trigger, why had he turned on the person who should represent safety and partnership? Sarah spent the afternoon reviewing personnel files and interview transcripts from the domestic violence case. What she discovered made her hands shake as she read. Officer Hendricks had been struggling with his own psychological response to the traumatic scene. In the weeks following the incident, several colleagues had noted changes in his behavior, increased irritability, difficulty sleeping, and a tendency to be more aggressive during training exercises. Dogs, especially highly bonded working dogs, were incredibly sensitive to changes in their handlers' emotional states. If Hendricks had been unconsciously transmitting stress, anger, or trauma through his body language and energy, Storm would have absorbed and reflected those emotions. The attack during training suddenly made sense. Storm hadn't become vicious. He'd become overwhelmed by conflicting instincts and emotions that he couldn't process or express in any other way. The dog, who had spent years being praised for controlled aggression in specific situations, had found himself in an environment where every stimulus triggered memories of violence and loss, while his primary source of guidance and stability, his handler, was radiating the same stress and trauma that Storm was experiencing. As Sarah pieced together this psychological puzzle, one detail from the incident report caught her attention. According to witnesses, Storm had stopped his attack on Officer Hendricks immediately when a specific word was shouted across the training area. Not a command or a correction, but a name. The name of the little girl from that terrible domestic violence call 3 months ago. Emily. The children Storm had comforted while they waited for help had been named Emily and Marcus. Emily, the 6-year-old, had whispered to Storm while they waited, telling him he was a good dog, promising him that everything would be okay. And somehow, in the chaos of the training exercise that had triggered his breakdown, the sound of that little girl's name had cut through his panic and reminded him who he really was. Sarah realized she wasn't just dealing with a case of canine aggression. She was looking at the aftermath of a shared trauma that had affected both dog and handler in ways the department's standard protocols weren't equipped to address. Storm didn't need to be put down. He needed to heal. And that healing would require understanding not just what had happened to him, but what that terrible day had done to everyone involved, including the children whose lives he'd helped save. The real work was just beginning. Sarah Martinez arrived at Children's Hospital early Wednesday morning, her mind racing with questions about the connection between Storm's breakdown and the children he'd helped save. Getting permission to speak with Emily and Marcus had required hours of phone calls. But the hospital social worker had finally agreed to a brief meeting after Sarah explained the potential therapeutic implications for both the children and the canine. The pediatric wing felt like a different world from the stark police facilities Sarah usually worked in. Bright murals covered the walls, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the playrooms. But as Sarah approached room 314, where Emily and Marcus were staying while their custody situation was resolved, the weight of their trauma felt heavy in the air. Dr. Rachel Chen, the children's therapist, met Sarah outside the room. "They've been asking about the dog," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Emily especially. She draws pictures of him constantly and keeps asking if he's okay. Marcus is more withdrawn, but he mentions Storm every time we talk about that day." Through the window, Sarah could see the children. Emily was a small girl with dark hair pulled into pigtails, carefully coloring in a sketchbook. Marcus, 2 years older, sat nearby building something complex with Legos. Both looked far too serious for their ages. "The thing is, Dr. Progressive took back-to-back from the mask," Chen continued. "They seem to have formed an incredibly strong bond with Storm in those few hours. Emily keeps saying he protected them, that he knew they were scared, and stayed close to make them feel safe. For children who've experienced such severe trauma, that connection to something they perceive as protective and caring is actually quite significant for their healing process." Sarah entered the room slowly, introducing herself as someone who worked with police dogs and was trying to help Storm. Emily's face lit up immediately. "You know Storm?" Emily asked, dropping her crayon and rushing over. "Is he okay? The policeman said he was a good boy, but then they took him away and nobody would tell us where he went." Marcus looked up from his Legos, his expression guarded but interested. "Is Storm in trouble?" he asked. "He didn't do anything wrong. He was just trying to help us." Sarah knelt down to Emily's level, choosing her words carefully. "Storm is safe, but he's very sad right now. That day at your house was very scary for him too. And sometimes when dogs get really scared or confused, they need help feeling better, just like people do." Emily nodded solemnly. "Mama always said dogs have feelings too. Storm was sad when he found us. I could tell because his ears were down and he made soft crying sounds. But then he stayed with us and I felt less scared." Marcus joined the conversation, his voice quiet but determined. "He let us pet him while we waited." Emily was shaking and Storm pushed his head against her hand so she could feel his fur. "He knew we needed him, Doctor." Chen had warned Sarah that the children's memories of that day were fragmented and sometimes contradictory, typical for trauma survivors. But their recollections of Storm were remarkably clear and consistent. To them, he wasn't just a police dog doing his job. He was the source of comfort and protection in their darkest moment. "Can you tell me more about what Storm was like with you?" Sarah asked. Emily retrieved her sketchbook and flipped through page after page of drawings. Some showed Storm as a large, protective presence, standing between the children and dark, scary shapes. Others depicted him sitting calmly while stick-figure children petted him. In every picture, Storm was drawn with careful detail. His pointed ears, his alert eyes, his thick tail. He knew we were scared of loud noises, Marcus explained. There were sirens and people shouting outside, but when we got scared, Storm would move closer and make these quiet huffing sounds. It was like he was telling us everything would be okay. And he smelled good, Emily added. Not like the bad smells in the house. He smelled like outside and grass and safe things. Sarah felt a chill as she began to understand the depth of the connection these children had formed with Storm. In their minds, he wasn't just present during their rescue. He was actively engaged in caring for them, reading their emotional needs and responding accordingly. But there was something else in their descriptions that caught Sarah's attention. The children described Storm as making deliberate choices about how to interact with them, displaying an emotional intelligence that went far beyond basic canine training. Emily, Sarah said gently, do you remember what you said to Storm while you were waiting? Emily's eyes brightened. I told him lots of things. I told him he was the goodest boy, and that I hoped he had a family who loved him, and that when I got bigger I was going to get a dog just like him. She paused, thinking, and I told him my name because Mama always said it's polite to introduce yourself. Did Storm seem to understand you? Oh yes, Emily said with absolute certainty. He looked right at me when I said my name. His ears went up and his tail moved just a little bit. He knew I was talking to him.
Marcus nodded in agreement.
Dogs are smarter than people think. Storm understood everything. Sarah spent another hour with the children, gathering details about their interaction with Storm. What emerged was a picture of a dog who had somehow shifted from his role as a working canine to becoming a therapy animal, instinctively providing exactly the kind of comfort and security the traumatized children needed. But the most important revelation came as Sarah was preparing to leave. Emily grabbed her arm, her small face serious. When you see Storm, will you tell him something for me? Emily asked. Of course. Tell him I remember his promise. Sarah frowned. What promise, sweetheart? When I was really scared and I thought the bad man might come back, I whispered to Storm that I wished someone could promise me I'd be safe. And Storm put his head right against my cheek and made a soft sound, like he was whispering back. It felt like a promise that he'd always watch out for me, even if he couldn't stay with us. Dr. Chen later explained that children Emily's age often created symbolic meaning around traumatic events as a way of processing experiences too complex for their developing minds to handle directly. But as Sarah drove back to the canine facility, she couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's interpretation might be more accurate than anyone realized. Storm had formed a protective bond with these children that transcended his training, and if that was true, then his recent aggressive behavior might not be about trauma in the abstract sense. It might be about his inability to fulfill what he perceived as an ongoing responsibility to protect Emily and Marcus. Back at the facility, Sarah found Storm in the same agitated state, but now she was looking at his behavior through a completely different lens. She requested access to Storm's recent work schedule and discovered something telling. His performance had started declining about a month ago, right around the time when follow-up visits and court proceedings related to the domestic violence case had intensified. Every time Storm's handler had to deal with paperwork, interviews, or court appearances related to that case, Storm would have been exposed to reminders of the children and their situation. For a dog who had formed such a strong protective bond, being unable to check on Emily and Marcus would have created enormous psychological stress. Sarah decided to try something unprecedented. She contacted Dr. Strauss. Channon proposed a carefully supervised reunion between Storm and the children. The idea was controversial. Using traumatized children in the rehabilitation of a potentially dangerous canine was exactly the kind of liability risk that police departments typically avoided. But Dr. Chen was intrigued by the therapeutic potential for all parties involved. The children had been asking about Storm constantly, she explained. They're worried about him, which is actually interfering with their own healing process. They feel responsible for his well-being, which is a heavy emotional burden for children their age.
It took extensive negotiations with hospital administration, police department lawyers, and Child Protective Services, but by Thursday afternoon, Sarah had secured permission for a controlled meeting between Storm and the children under strict medical supervision. The reunion was scheduled to take place in the hospital's therapy garden, a secure outdoor space designed for patient visits.
Storm would be heavily sedated to ensure he remained calm, and multiple handlers would be present as backup. Sarah would monitor his behavior throughout the interaction, ready to intervene at the first sign of stress or aggression. As they prepared for the meeting, Tom Bradley expressed serious reservations. You're betting everything on the theory that this dog forms some kind of supernatural bond with these kids, he said. What if you're wrong? What if seeing them triggers another aggressive episode? Sarah understood the risks, but something in her gut told her that Storm's aggression wasn't random or unpredictable. It was the manifestation of a frustrated protective instinct that had nowhere to go. If she was right, seeing that Emily and Marcus were safe and cared for might actually provide the closure Storm needed to begin healing. The morning of the reunion, Sarah arrived early to prepare Storm for transport. She found him in a state she'd never seen before, not agitated or defensive, but eerily still. He sat in the center of his cage, staring at the door with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It's like he knows something's happening, Tom observed. Been like that since about 6 this morning. As they prepared the transport crate, Storm displayed none of his usual resistance to handling. He walked calmly into the crate and settled down without protest. During the drive to the hospital, he remained alert but calm, occasionally sniffing the air as if trying to identify familiar scents. The therapy garden was a beautiful space filled with flowering plants and comfortable seating areas. Chen had prepared Emily and Marcus for the reunion, explaining that Storm might look different than they remembered, that trauma could change animals just like it changed people. When the transport crate was opened, Storm emerged slowly, his body language cautious but not defensive. He scanned the garden methodically, his nose twitching as he processed the multitude of scents. Then Emily stepped into view. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. Storm's entire posture changed. His ears snapped forward, his tail began a slow wag, and he made a soft whining sound that Sarah had never heard from him before. But he didn't move toward Emily. Instead, he looked directly at Sarah, as if asking for permission. "Storm," Sarah said quietly, using a release command she'd learned from his training files. "Friend." Storm approached Emily with careful, deliberate steps. "Staff." And from start. When he reached her, he sat down and gently pressed his head against her small hands, just as Emily had described from that terrible day 3 months ago. "I knew you'd remember me," Emily whispered, burying her face in Storm's fur. "I knew you wouldn't forget your promise." Marcus joined them, and Storm shifted slightly to include both children in his protective circle. For 20 minutes, they sat together in the garden, while Storm seemed to conduct his own assessment of their well-being. He sniffed them carefully, checking for signs of injury or illness. He observed their body language and listened to their voices. He allowed them to pet and hug him while remaining alert to any potential threats in the surrounding area. Most remarkably, when a maintenance worker with a leaf blower started up nearby, creating sudden loud noise, Storm immediately positioned himself between the children and the sound source, providing the same protective presence he'd offered during their original trauma. It was during this reunion that Sarah finally understood what had been driving Storm's recent behavior. He hadn't become violent because he was broken or dangerous. He'd become desperate because he couldn't fulfill what he perceived as an ongoing obligation to protect 2 children who had trusted him completely in their moment of greatest need. The single word that had stopped his attack during training, Emily, had cut through his psychological chaos because it represented the real reason for his distress. He wasn't just a traumatized canine who needed rehabilitation. He was a protector who had been separated from those he'd sworn to protect. As the reunion came to an end, Emily hugged Storm tightly and whispered something in his ear that only he could hear. Storm's tail wagged once, and for the first time since his breakdown, his body language reflected complete calm. Sarah realized that Storm's healing wouldn't just require addressing his trauma. It would require honoring the profound emotional connection he'd formed with these children and finding a way to transform his protective instincts into something positive and sustainable. The transformation in Storm after his reunion with Emily and Marcus was so dramatic that even the skeptics at the police department had to acknowledge something extraordinary had occurred. For the first time in weeks, Storm ate a full meal, drank water normally, and slept through the night without the constant vigilance that had characterized his behavior since the breakdown. But Sarah knew that a single positive interaction wouldn't solve the complex psychological issues that had led to Storm's crisis. The dog needed a comprehensive rehabilitation plan that addressed both his trauma and his need to fulfill the protective role that had become central to his identity. Working with Dr. Chen, Sarah developed an unprecedented program that would revolutionize how law enforcement agencies approached canine psychological care. The plan involved gradually retraining Storm's protective instincts while maintaining his connection to Emily and Marcus through supervised visits that would benefit all parties involved. The first challenge was convincing the police department to approve such an unconventional approach. Captain Morrison, the head of the K-9 unit, had been ready to approve Storm's euthanization before Sarah's intervention. The idea of using two traumatized children as part of a police dog's therapy program seemed both logistically impossible and potentially dangerous. "You're asking me to transform our K-9 unit into a social services program," Captain Morrison said during a tense meeting in his office. "We train these dogs for law enforcement, not therapy work. What happens when Storm's needed for an actual police operation? Do we call Emily and Marcus to give him permission?" Sarah had anticipated this resistance, and she'd spent days researching precedents for dual-purpose working dogs. What she found was a growing body of evidence supporting the use of specially trained canines in victim services, particularly for cases involving children who had experienced trauma. "Storm doesn't need to choose between police work and protection of Emily and Marcus," Sarah explained. "We can train him to understand that his protective role now includes helping other children in similar situations. He can become a specialized canine for victim services while maintaining his law enforcement capabilities." The proposal required approval from multiple departments, insurance companies, and child welfare agencies, but the potential benefits were enormous. Children who had experienced trauma often struggled to trust adult authority figures, but many responded positively to specially trained therapy animals. Storm could become the first K-9 in the Pacific Northwest, specifically trained to provide comfort and security to child victims of violent crimes. While the bureaucratic wheels turned, Sarah began working directly with Storm on rebuilding his emotional stability. The key was helping him understand that his protective instincts could be channeled in ways that didn't require constant physical presence with Emily and Marcus. The training process was unlike anything Sarah had ever attempted. Instead of traditional canine obedience work, she focused on teaching Storm to recognize and respond to signs of fear, anxiety, and trauma in children. Using volunteer children from a local youth center, Sarah created controlled scenarios where Storm could practice providing comfort and security without becoming overwhelming or possessive. The breakthrough came during a session with a 10-year-old boy named David who had witnessed a car accident that killed his sister. David had been unable to speak about the incident for months, but when Storm approached him in the training room, something shifted. The boy began talking to Storm about his fear, his sadness, and his guilt about surviving when his sister didn't. Storm's response was remarkable. Without any specific training for this situation, he seemed to intuitively understand what David needed. He positioned himself close enough to provide comfort but far enough away to avoid seeming threatening. He remained perfectly still while David petted him and talked, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to encourage the boy to continue sharing his feelings. Dr. Chen, who observed the session, was amazed by Storm's natural ability to provide therapeutic presence. "Most therapy animals require months of specialized training to develop this kind of sensitivity," she explained. "Storm seems to have developed these skills organically through his experience with Emily and Marcus." Sarah realized that Storm's breakdown hadn't been a failure of his training. It had been the result of his extraordinary emotional intelligence being overwhelmed by circumstances he couldn't control or understand. Rather than diminishing his value as a working dog, his experience had actually enhanced his ability to connect with and help traumatized individuals. After 6 weeks of intensive rehabilitation, Storm was ready for his first official assignment as a dual-purpose K-9. The case involved a 7-year-old girl named Sophie who had witnessed her mother's murder and was scheduled to testify in court against the perpetrator. Sophie had been unable to speak to investigators about what she'd seen, and prosecutors were concerned that without her testimony, the case might be dismissed. The courthouse meeting was carefully planned. Sophie's advocate, a social worker named Janet Coleman, had prepared the girl for the presence of a police dog, explaining that Storm was there to help her feel safe while she talked about difficult things. The interview room was set up to be as non-threatening as possible, with comfortable seating and toys available. When Storm entered the room, his demeanor was completely professional yet gentle. He approached Sophie slowly, allowing her to decide how much interaction she wanted. Sophie, who had been withdrawn and fearful, immediately showed interest in the large dog.
"He's really big," Sophie whispered, the first word she'd spoken since arriving at the courthouse.
"His name is Storm," Sarah explained.
"He's here because he's very good at helping children feel brave when they need to talk about scary things." Over the next hour, with Storm lying quietly beside her chair, Sophie began to open up about the night her mother died. She spoke directly to Storm at first, as if he were the only one in the room who could understand her fear. Gradually, she began including the adults in her account, providing detailed testimony that would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. The prosecutor later said it was the most effective victim interview he'd ever witnessed. Sophie's testimony, delivered while one hand rested on Storm's back, was clear, detailed, and emotionally honest in a way that would have been impossible without the dog's calming presence. But the real validation of Sarah's approach came from an unexpected source. During a break in the court proceedings, Sophie asked if she could tell Storm something private. Sarah stepped back while Sophie whispered into the dog's ear for several minutes. When she finished, Sophie looked directly at Sarah. Storm says he has friends named Emily and Marcus who went through something scary too, and they're okay now. He says if they can be brave, then I can be brave too. Sarah felt chills run down her spine. Sophie had no way of knowing about Storm's connection to Emily and Marcus, yet somehow the bond Storm had formed with those children had become part of his ability to help other traumatized kids. Word of Storm's success spread quickly through the law enforcement and social services communities.
Within months, Sarah was fielding requests from police departments across the country, asking for guidance on developing similar programs. Storm became the model for a new type of canine service that combined traditional police work with specialized victim support.
The most rewarding moment came 6 months after Storm's breakdown during a scheduled visit with Emily and Marcus. The children had been placed with a loving foster family and were making excellent progress in therapy. Their bond with Storm remained strong, but it had evolved into something healthier and more sustainable. Emily, now 7 years old and much more confident, showed Storm her latest drawings. They no longer depicted him as a protective barrier against dark forces. Instead, they showed him helping other children, teaching them to be brave, surrounded by rainbows and sunshine. Storm has an important job now, Emily explained to her foster mother. He helps kids like me and Marcus when they're scared. He's like a superhero, but with fur. Marcus, approaching his 10th birthday, had developed a sophisticated understanding of Storm's role. He learned how to turn his sadness into something good, Marcus observed with the wisdom of a child who had faced terrible things and survived. He helps other kids because he knows what it feels like to be scared. Sarah realized that Storm's story had become something much larger than the rehabilitation of a single canine. It had demonstrated that the bonds formed between humans and animals during traumatic experiences could be transformed into healing tools that benefited entire communities. The police department officially designated Storm as their first victim services canine, with specialized training and certification for working with traumatized children. His schedule was split between traditional law enforcement duties and victim support cases, allowing him to maintain his police skills while developing his therapeutic abilities. Dr. Chen began incorporating Storm into her regular therapy sessions with child trauma survivors. The waiting list for appointments with the therapy dog, who was also a police officer, grew so long that the hospital began training other dogs using Storm's protocols. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the law enforcement community began viewing the psychological well-being of their canine partners. Storm's breakdown and recovery had revealed that these highly intelligent animals could experience trauma, form emotional attachments, and develop depression or anxiety just like their human counterparts. Police departments across the country began implementing new protocols for canine mental health, including regular psychological evaluations, stress management training, and support programs for dogs who had been exposed to traumatic situations. Storm's case had opened a conversation about the emotional lives of working animals that had been largely ignored until his crisis forced everyone to pay attention. The bond between Storm and Emily and Marcus never faded, but it evolved into something beautiful and sustainable. The children visited Storm regularly at the police station, where they served as junior volunteers helping to socialize new therapy dogs. They took enormous pride in Storm's work and often shared their own experiences with other children who were working with him. Emily in particular developed a special gift for explaining to other traumatized children what it felt like to trust Storm. "He keeps all your scary feelings safe while you figure out how to be brave again," she would tell them. "And he never forgets to be gentle, even when he's being strong." The ripple effects of Storm's transformation continued to expand. Sarah found herself consulting with KB9 units around the world, helping to establish victim services programs based on Storm's model. Universities began studying the psychological bonds between working dogs and trauma survivors, leading to advances in both animal psychology and human therapy techniques. Storm himself seemed to thrive in his dual role. His work with traumatized children appeared to provide him with a sense of purpose that pure law enforcement had never quite satisfied. He maintained his edge for traditional police work while developing an almost supernatural ability to sense when a child needed comfort, protection, or just someone who understood what it meant to survive something terrible. The word that had stopped Storm's breakdown, Emily, became a symbol within the canine community of the power of connection and purpose. Trainers began teaching handlers to recognize signs of emotional attachment in their dogs, not as something to discourage, but as a strength that could be channeled into more effective and compassionate police work. Storm's story had proven that sometimes the most devastating breakdowns could lead to the most meaningful breakthroughs, and that healing often came not from forgetting traumatic experiences, but from finding ways to transform them into sources of strength for others who needed hope. 2 years after Storm's breakdown and remarkable recovery, Sarah Martinez found herself standing in the conference room of the National Police Canine Association, addressing an audience of handlers, trainers, and administrators from across North America. The presentation she was about to give would challenge decades of traditional thinking about working dog psychology and reshape how law enforcement agencies approached canine emotional wellness. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, clicking to the first slide of her presentation, I want to tell you about the day we almost put down one of the most valuable canines in police service history because we didn't understand the difference between trauma and transformation. Many of the veteran handlers in the room had spent their careers believing that emotional attachment beyond the basic handler-dog bond was a liability in police work. The idea that a canine could experience complex psychological trauma and emerge stronger from it challenged everything they thought they knew about working dogs. But as Sarah walked through Storm's case study, sharing video footage of his work with traumatized children and statistical data about his success rate in victim services, the skepticism began to shift into fascination. Storm had not only recovered from his breakdown, but had become one of the most effective canines in the country, with a success rate in child victim interviews that exceeded traditional methods by over 300%. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a veterinary behaviorist from the University of California, raised her hand during the question period. Ms. Martinez, your data is compelling, but how do we replicate this? Storm's case seems so specific to his particular trauma and the children he bonded with. Can these techniques work with other dogs who haven't had such a dramatic emotional experience? Sarah smiled, knowing this question was coming.
Dr. Assman.
Vasquez, that's exactly what we've spent the past 18 months testing. I'd like to introduce you to the Pacific Northwest Regional Canine Victim Services Program, which now includes 12 dogs trained using protocols developed from Storm's rehabilitation. The program had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. After Storm's success became widely known, police departments throughout Washington, Oregon, and Northern California had requested training for their own victim services canine teams. Sarah had worked with animal behaviorists, child psychologists, and veteran canine trainers to develop a comprehensive curriculum that could identify and train dogs with the emotional intelligence necessary for trauma-sensitive work. Not every dog was suitable for this specialized role. The selection process required animals with exceptional emotional stability, high intelligence, and what Sarah had learned to recognize as empathetic awareness. The ability to read and respond to human emotional states with unusual sensitivity. Out of nearly 200 dogs tested, only 37 had demonstrated the necessary combination of traits. But those dogs who did qualify had achieved remarkable results. Detective Lisa Park from the Portland Police Bureau had partnered with a Belgian Malinois named Atlas, who specialized in working with teenage victims of sexual assault. Atlas had been present during interviews that led to the conviction of a serial predator who had been targeting high school students for over 2 years. The victims trusted Atlas in a way they couldn't trust any adult in the room, Detective Park explained during a phone conference with Sarah's team. These teenagers had been betrayed by adults who were supposed to protect them. But Atlas represented something pure, protection without the possibility of betrayal. They could tell him things they couldn't tell anyone else. The success stories kept mounting. Officer James Wright and his German Shepherd partner Nova had helped a 6-year-old boy provide testimony about witnessing a gang shooting. The child had been too terrified to speak to investigators for weeks, but with Nova beside him, he was able to give a detailed account that led to arrests in the case. Perhaps most remarkably, these victim services canines had begun demonstrating abilities that seemed to go beyond their training. They could apparently sense when a child was holding back information, when someone was becoming overwhelmed by emotion, or when an interview needed to be paused for the well-being of the victim. Dr. Michael Torres, a child psychologist who had worked with several of the victim services teams, documented behaviors that challenged traditional understanding of animal cognition. These dogs aren't just providing comfort, he explained in a research paper that would later be published in the Journal of Applied Animal Psychology. They're actively participating in the therapeutic process, making decisions about when to provide physical contact, when to create distance, and when to redirect a child's attention. Storm himself had become the unofficial leader of this new generation of canines. When new dogs entered the program, they were often brought to meet Storm as part of their socialization process. Handlers reported that dogs seemed to learn by observing Storm's work, picking up subtle techniques that couldn't be taught through traditional training methods. Emily and Marcus, now 9 and 11 years old respectively, had become unofficial ambassadors for the program. Their foster family, the Johnsons, had embraced their connection to Storm and regularly brought them to police department events where they could share their story with other children who are working with victim services canines. Emily had developed into a confident, articulate child who took pride in explaining to other kids how Storm had helped her find courage. During one particularly moving presentation at a victim advocates conference, she stood before an audience of hardened law enforcement professionals and social workers and reduced many of them to tears. When bad things happen, sometimes grown-ups don't know what to say to make you feel better, Emily explained, standing next to Storm, who sat perfectly still beside the podium. But Storm doesn't need words. He just knows how to make the scared feelings smaller so the brave feelings can get bigger. Marcus had developed a more analytical understanding of Storm's work, often asking detailed questions about dog psychology and training techniques. He had announced his intention to become a canine trainer when he grew up, specifically to work with dogs who help traumatized children. Storm taught me that even when really bad things happen, they can turn into good things if you figure out how to help other people. Marcus explained to a journalist who was writing an article about the program for National Geographic. He couldn't save us from what happened, but he could save other kids from feeling as scared as we did. The media attention surrounding Storm and the Victim Services Program had been overwhelming at times, but it had also led to funding opportunities that allowed the program to expand rapidly. The Department of Justice had provided a federal grant to establish similar programs in 10 major metropolitan areas across the country. Sarah found herself traveling constantly, training new teams and consulting on difficult cases, but she always returned to Seattle to check on Storm and continued developing new protocols for canine trauma recovery. One case in particular had tested the limits of what victim services canines could accomplish. A 4-year-old girl named Sophia had been found after being missing for 3 days, during which she had experienced trauma so severe that she had stopped speaking entirely. Child psychologists had exhausted traditional therapeutic approaches without making any progress. Storm's work with Sophia required 6 months of patient, careful interaction. The little girl would only communicate through Storm, whispering to him while he lay quietly beside her during therapy sessions. Gradually, Storm seemed to find ways to encourage Sophia to include others in her communication, serving as a bridge between the child and the adults who were trying to help her heal. The breakthrough came during what seemed like an ordinary session.
Sophia was, as usual, whispering something to Storm, when suddenly she looked up at Sarah and spoke her first words in over 6 months. "Storm says you want to help me feel safe." Dr. Chen, who had continued working with trauma-affected children and their canine partners, theorized that dogs like Storm served as emotional interpreters for children who couldn't process or articulate their feelings directly.
The children project their fears, hopes, and needs onto these dogs, who then reflect back a sense of safety and understanding that the children can accept more easily than direct human comfort. But Sarah suspected something even more profound was happening. She had observed Storm and other victim services canines making decisions and adjustments during therapy sessions that seemed to indicate a level of emotional intelligence that science was only beginning to understand. During one session with a teenage boy who had survived a school shooting, Storm had done something unprecedented. The boy was becoming increasingly agitated while recounting his experience, and everyone in the room could see that he was approaching a panic attack. Suddenly, Storm stood up and deliberately knocked over a cup of water on the table, creating a distraction that broke the boy's spiral into panic, without making him feel interrupted or dismissed. There was no command, no signal from anyone in the room, Sarah noted in her case files.
Storm made an independent decision to intervene in a way that preserved the boy's dignity while protecting his psychological well-being. These observations had led to a research partnership with the University of Washington's Animal Cognition Lab, where scientists were studying the neurological basis for the extraordinary emotional intelligence displayed by victim services canines. Preliminary findings suggested that dogs selected for this work had unusual activity patterns in brain regions associated with empathy and social cognition.
Dr. Amanda Foster, the lead researcher on the project, had been initially skeptical of claims about canine emotional intelligence. But after months of working with Storm and other victim services dogs, she had become a convert. These dogs are demonstrating cognitive abilities that we previously thought were unique to humans and a few other highly intelligent species. Dr. Prayton, Foster explained during a research presentation. They're not just responding to training or mimicking human behavior. They're making complex emotional assessments and developing therapeutic strategies adapted to individual children's needs. The research had profound implications beyond law enforcement applications. Hospitals, schools, and therapeutic facilities were beginning to explore how victim services canine protocols could be adapted for other settings where children experience trauma or stress. Storm's influence had even reached international law enforcement agencies. Police departments in the United Kingdom, Australia, and several European countries had sent representatives to train with Sarah's team and establish their own victim services programs. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of Storm's work came from an unexpected source. Officer David Hendricks, Storm's original handler who had been attacked during the training exercise that triggered Storm's breakdown, requested a meeting with Sarah after 18 months of his own therapy and recovery. Hendricks had struggled with guilt and PTSD following the incident, feeling responsible for Storm's psychological crisis. He had initially been resistant to Storm's transition into victim services work, viewing it as evidence that he had somehow failed as a handler. "I thought I had broken him," Hendricks admitted during their conversation in Sarah's office. "I kept thinking that if I had been better at reading his emotional state, if I had gotten him help sooner after that domestic violence call, none of this would have happened." Sarah helped Hendricks understand that Storm's breakdown hadn't been caused by poor handling or inadequate care. It had been the inevitable result of an extraordinarily sensitive dog being exposed to trauma while lacking the tools to process and integrate that experience. "Storm didn't break down because you failed him," Sarah explained. "He broke down because he formed an emotional connection so profound that it overwhelmed his ability to function within the constraints of traditional canine work. What happened to him led to the development of entirely new approaches to working dog psychology that are helping hundreds of animals and victims." Hendricks eventually requested assignment to the Victim Services Program, working with a specially trained golden retriever named Hope to provide support for elderly victims of financial abuse and elder exploitation. His experience with Storm's crisis had given him unique insights into recognizing early signs of psychological stress in canine partners. "Storm taught me that these dogs are more complex emotionally than we ever gave them credit for," Hendricks reflected. "My job isn't just to work with Hope. It's to understand her emotional needs and make sure she has the support she requires to do this difficult work without burning out." As Storm approached his 6th year of service and his 4th year in victim services work, he showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, his abilities seemed to continue developing and refining. He had worked with over 400 child victims, with a success rate in obtaining usable testimony that had made him a legendary figure in law enforcement circles. But Sarah knew that Storm's greatest achievement wasn't his individual success. It was the transformation he had inspired in how society understood and utilized the emotional intelligence of working animals. Storm had proven that the bond between humans and dogs could be a powerful tool for healing, and that sometimes the most devastating breakdowns could lead to the most revolutionary breakthroughs. 5 years after the incident that nearly ended Storm's career, Sarah Martinez stood in the same training facility where she had first encountered the broken, desperate dog who would change everything she thought she knew about canine psychology. But today, the facility looked completely different. Where once there had been stark, concrete kennels designed purely for containment, there were now comfortable spaces designed with the emotional well-being of the animals in mind. The transformation wasn't just physical. The Seattle Police Department's K9 unit had become a model for law enforcement agencies worldwide, demonstrating how understanding and addressing the psychological needs of working dogs could dramatically improve both their performance and their quality of life. Storm, now 8 years old and a senior member of the force, moved through the facility with the confident ease of a dog who had found his true calling. His coat had regained its lustrous shine, and his eyes held the alert intelligence of an animal who was not just surviving but thriving in work that aligned perfectly with his deepest instincts. But this wasn't just any ordinary day at the facility. Today marked the inauguration of the Storm Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to training victim services K9s and supporting law enforcement agencies in developing psychological wellness programs for their working animals. Emily and Marcus, now 14 and 16, had played crucial roles in establishing the foundation. Emily had become an accomplished public speaker, sharing her story with audiences around the country and advocating for the therapeutic use of specially trained animals in trauma recovery. Marcus had developed into a skilled young trainer, working with puppy candidates for the Victim Services Program and demonstrating an intuitive understanding of animal psychology that reminded everyone of Storm's natural abilities. "Storm didn't just save us that day in the closet," Emily explained to the gathered crowd of law enforcement officials, child advocates, and media representatives. "He spent the next 5 years saving other kids, and now we want to make sure that never stops happening."
The foundation had already secured funding to train 50 new victim services canine teams over the next 3 years. More importantly, it had established research partnerships with veterinary schools and psychology departments to continue studying the neurological and behavioral basis for the remarkable emotional intelligence displayed by dogs, like Storm. Rachel Chen, now the foundation's clinical director, had documented outcomes that exceeded everyone's expectations. Children who participated in victim services canine programs showed dramatically faster recovery times from trauma, higher rates of successful testimony in court proceedings, and better long-term psychological adjustment compared to children who received traditional therapeutic interventions alone. What Storm pioneered has become the gold standard for trauma-informed victim services, Dr. Chen explained during the foundation launch ceremony. We now have empirical evidence that the human-animal bond can be a powerful tool for healing when properly understood and carefully applied. The research had revealed fascinating insights into how dogs like Storm processed and responded to human emotional distress. Brain imaging studies showed that victim services canines had developed neural pathways that allowed them to recognize and respond to specific stress hormones and pheromones associated with trauma responses in children. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had initially questioned the replicability of Storm's success, had become one of the leading researchers in the field of therapeutic working dog psychology. Her latest study had identified genetic markers associated with the empathetic awareness that made certain dogs suitable for victim services work. Storm represents an evolutionary leap in working dog capabilities, Dr. Vasquez explained to the assembled crowd. He and dogs like him are demonstrating cognitive and emotional abilities that are reshaping our understanding of animal intelligence and consciousness. But the most profound changes had occurred in the children whose lives Storm had touched. Sarah maintained contact with many of the young victims Storm had worked with over the years, and their stories of recovery and resilience had become powerful testimonies to the transformative power of the human-animal bond. Sophia, the 4-year-old who had stopped speaking after her traumatic ordeal, was now 9 years old and thriving in school. She had maintained her special connection to Storm, visiting him regularly and often helping to introduce new child victims to the Victim Services Program. Storm taught me that being scared doesn't mean you're weak, Sophia explained during a video interview that would be shown at the foundation launch. It just means you need someone who understands scary feelings to help you remember how to be brave. David, the teenager who had survived the school shooting, had gone on to college and was studying to become a trauma counselor. He credited his work with Storm as the turning point in his recovery and had requested that the foundation provide him with a therapy dog to assist in his future counseling practice. These success stories had attracted international attention. Police departments from Japan, Germany, Australia, and Canada had sent representatives to train with Sarah's team. The protocols developed from Storm's case were being adapted for different cultures and legal systems, but the core principle remained the same. Animals with the right temperament and training could serve as bridges between traumatized children and the adults trying to help them heal. Storm himself had achieved a kind of celebrity status in law enforcement circles, but he seemed oblivious to his fame. His focus remained entirely on the work, and his ability to connect with traumatized children appeared to be growing stronger with experience rather than diminishing with age. One recent case had particularly demonstrated Storm's continued evolution as a therapeutic partner. A 7-year-old boy named Alex had been rescued from a human trafficking situation after being missing for over a year. The trauma he had experienced was so severe that child psychologists were concerned about his ability to ever form trusting relationships with adults again. Alex's first meeting with Storm had been unlike any Sarah had previously observed. The boy had been completely unresponsive to all attempts at human interaction, but when Storm entered the room, something shifted. Storm had approached very slowly, settling himself several feet away from Alex and simply waiting. For over an hour, neither the boy nor the dog moved. Then, gradually, Alex began to inch closer to Storm. When he finally reached the dog, he buried his face in Storm's fur and began to cry for the first time since his rescue. Storm somehow knew that this child needed to feel in control of the interaction, observed Dr. Janet Morrison, the child psychologist overseeing Alex's care. He gave Alex the space and time to choose connection rather than having it forced on him. It was like watching a master therapist at work. Over the following months, Storm had become Alex's primary therapeutic partner. The boy would only speak during sessions when Storm was present, and his recovery had progressed far more rapidly than anyone had dared to hope. Alex told me that Storm has magic in his fur that takes away bad dreams. From a scientific perspective, we know it's not magic. It's the result of careful training, exceptional emotional intelligence, and the profound healing power of unconditional acceptance. But for a child who had given up hope, Storm's presence feels miraculous. The Foundation launch also marked the announcement of a major expansion in victim services canine training. The Department of Justice had awarded a multi-million-dollar grant to establish regional training centers in 12 major metropolitan areas, each capable of training and deploying teams of victim services canines. Sarah would oversee the expansion as the Foundation's national training director, but her primary focus would remain on continuing research into the psychological mechanisms that made dogs like Storm so effective. She was particularly interested in exploring whether similar principles could be applied to other forms of therapy, animal work. Storm's story began with what appeared to be a catastrophic failure, Sarah reflected during her keynote address at the Foundation launch. A highly trained police dog had what seemed to be a complete psychological breakdown. Traditional protocols would have labeled him irreparably damaged and recommended euthanization, but Storm taught us that what looks like failure might actually be transformation in progress. His breakdown wasn't the end of his story, it was the beginning of a new chapter that would revolutionize how we understand and utilize the emotional intelligence of working animals. The ceremony concluded with a demonstration of Storm's work with a group of child actors portraying traumatized victims. Even though the scenarios were simulated, Storm's responses were authentic and nuanced, showing his ability to read subtle cues and adjust his behavior accordingly. As the audience watched Storm provide comfort to a young actress portraying a car accident victim, many were moved to tears by the gentle intelligence and profound empathy the dog displayed. His tail wagged softly as he allowed the girl to pet him, and he positioned himself to provide maximum comfort while remaining alert to her emotional needs. Emily and Marcus, now young adults who had grown up alongside Storm's transformation, served as honorary co-chairs of the Foundation. Their bond with Storm had evolved over the years, but it remained strong and meaningful to all of them. Storm will always be our hero, Marcus explained during an interview with a documentary crew filming the Foundation launch. But now he's a hero to hundreds of other kids too. That's what makes us most proud, knowing that the love and protection he gave us has multiplied into something that helps so many others. Emily nodded in agreement. When I was 6 years old and hiding in that closet, I thought Storm was just a police dog doing his job. Now I know he was so much more than that. He was showing us that even in the darkest, scariest moments, there's always someone who cares enough to stay with you until you remember how to be brave again. The Foundation had already received applications from police departments in 37 states requesting victim services canine teams. The waiting list for training was over 2 years long, testament to the growing recognition of how effective these specialized animals could be in trauma recovery work. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of the ceremony came when Storm was reunited with Officer David Hendricks, his original handler. Hendricks had requested the opportunity to present Storm with a special recognition award from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Storm taught me that strength isn't about never breaking down, Hendricks said as he fastened the ceremonial collar around Storm's neck. It's about finding the courage to transform your broken pieces into something that helps heal others. He didn't just recover from his crisis, he became something greater than anyone imagined possible. Storm accepted the honor with the quiet dignity that had characterized his work throughout his career. His tail wagged once as Hendricks scratched behind his ears, and for a moment, the crowded ceremony faded away as handler and dog shared a private moment of mutual respect and forgiveness. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself walking through the training facility with Storm, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. The dog who had once been so broken he couldn't be safely handled was now the inspiration for a movement that was transforming how society understood and utilized the healing power of human-animal bonds.
You know what the most amazing thing is? Sarah said to Storm as they paused in front of a wall covered with photos of all the children he had helped over the years.
You never forgot who you really were. Even when everyone else thought you were broken, you knew you were a protector. You just needed to find the right way to use that gift. Storm looked up at Sarah with the same intelligent, compassionate eyes that had first recognized Emily and Marcus as children who needed his protection. His tail wagged slowly, and Sarah could swear she saw understanding and contentment in his expression. The little girl's name, Emily, had indeed cut through the chaos of Storm's breakdown. But it hadn't just stopped his aggressive behavior. It had reminded him of his true purpose, and set him on a path that would touch hundreds of lives and revolutionize an entire field. As they walked toward the exit, Sarah realized that Storm's story was far from over. At 8 years old, he still had several good working years ahead of him, and the Foundation would ensure that his legacy continued long after his retirement. The principles he had pioneered would guide the training of countless future generations of victim services canines, and the children he had helped would carry forward his message of hope and healing.
The word that had once stopped a desperate dog in his tracks had become the foundation for a movement that proved the most powerful force in the world wasn't violence or fear, but the simple, profound connection between a traumatized soul and someone who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just stay close until the healing begins. Storm had taught them all that breakdown and breakthrough were often separated by nothing more than one word spoken at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person.
In his case, that word had been a little girl's name. But the lesson applied to everyone. Sometimes salvation comes not from forgetting our pain, but from finding ways to transform it into a source of strength for others who need to know they're not alone in the darkness.
The canine who had once devastated everything in his path had indeed been stopped by one word. But that word hadn't destroyed him. It had revealed his true destiny as a healer, protector, and living proof that even the most broken spirits could find their way back to purpose, meaning, and hope.
The canine devastated everything in her path, until one word cut through the chaos.